The first thing I noticed wasn't her voice. It was the way her thumb tapped the pen against the edge of the desk. A steady, deliberate rhythm meant to fill the silence. She leaned back in her chair, just enough to suggest confidence, but her eyes didn't quite hold mine. The scent of her perfume drifted across the polished wood, sharp, floral, the kind of designer choice meant to announce control before a single word was spoken. She smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was choreography. I'd seen better performances in hostile takeover meetings. My name is Daniel Kessler. I'm 57 years old. Until 5 minutes ago, I was the Chief Strategy Officer for Argonne Global Industries. 32 years at the same company. 6 of those in the basement with a folding desk and 1 rotary phone. The rest at the table where the real deals were made. She didn't know that part yet, or maybe she didn't care. She kept her gaze on a folder in front of her, opened it like it was routine, and slid the papers toward me without a flicker of hesitation. "Your experience is old news," she said, almost casually. "We need fresh blood, who lives in the current century." The pen kept tapping, metronome steady. I watched the muscles in her jaw tighten on the last word. She thought she was in control. I catalogued the rest. Shoulders angled slightly away. Disengagement. Left foot bouncing under the desk. Nerves. Overcompensating with eye contact when she remembered to use it. I'd read competitors for decades. She wasn't hard to read. I didn't reach for the papers right away. Instead, I glanced at the reflection in the glass wall behind her, noting the faint tremor in her elbow. Somewhere behind that confident script was a flicker of uncertainty. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and extended my hand. She hesitated half a second before shaking it. "Congratulations," I said. "You've just made a very bold move." And I smiled. Not forced, not strained, just enough to let her wonder what I meant. I walked out without looking back. No scene, no protest. I'd learned a long time ago, you don't win the real fight in the room where they fire you. You win it outside, in the silence that follows. The elevator ride down gave me 12 floors to think. 32 years, and over 71% of this company's total revenue traced directly back to projects I initiated, clients I landed, markets I opened. They'd run the numbers. They knew exactly what they were cutting loose, which meant this wasn't about performance. It was about image, optics, a story they could sell to investors about modernization. When I joined Argonne Global, it wasn't global at all. It was 2 rented rooms above a defunct print shop, a team of 4, and an accounts receivable ledger that looked like a countdown clock to bankruptcy. I was 25. Arrogant enough to believe I could build something from nothing, stubborn enough to keep going after I'd already been bankrupt twice. I learned early that business wasn't about numbers. It was about patterns, spotting them, exploiting them, moving before anyone else realized they'd shifted. In 2008, when the crash gutted half our industry, I didn't flinch. While others cut staff and hid in their offices, I secured 3 overseas contracts, locked in fixed-rate supply deals, and diversified into markets no one else would touch. That single year's moves accounted for almost a quarter of our decade-long growth. The board called it luck. I called it preparation. Luck doesn't last 32 years. I stepped out onto the street, the afternoon light catching the mirrored facade of the building I'd practically built from the inside out. People hurried past, glued to their phones, talking deals they thought were big. I'd made bigger. Lost bigger, too. The city hummed like it always did, indifferent to individual victories and defeats. As I crossed the plaza, I thought about her words. Fresh blood who lives in the current century. The arrogance in them wasn't personal. It was generational. She believed innovation was a product of youth. That time in the game dulled your edge. What she didn't understand was that the edge isn't something you get from a decade of LinkedIn hustle. It's something you earn from scars, economic, political, and personal. By the time I reached the parking garage, the initial sting was gone, replaced with something sharper, calmer. There's a particular clarity that comes when you know you've just been underestimated by someone in a position of power. It's not anger. It's opportunity. I started the car, the familiar growl of the engine grounding me in routine. The steering wheel felt the same as it did yesterday. The city streets still stretched out ahead in the same grid. The difference was perspective. I wasn't driving away from the company. I was driving toward the next move. She thought this was over. She had no idea it was just a transfer of power. I didn't go to the kitchen, didn't pour myself a drink. I drove straight home, parked in the garage, and went upstairs to the one room no one outside my inner circle had ever set foot in. On paper, it was my home office. In reality, it was a war room. The walls were lined with steel shelving, not books, and each shelf was packed with drives, servers, and archival cases. 3 monitors curved around the desk in a half moon, their dark screens waiting for the tap of a key. In the corner, a standalone tower hummed quietly. A private server with 32 years' worth of financial intelligence, market research, and internal communications from every company I'd ever touched. The chair was familiar under me, molded from hours of planning in this exact spot. I keyed in a passphrase, and the monitors came alive. Market tickers scrolled along the bottom, algorithmic watch lists blinking green and red. Secure chat clients pinged quietly in the background. I opened one folder, the one labeled with nothing more than a date, and pulled up the latest file. Audio. The morning's board meeting. I'd wired the conference room years ago, not for blackmail, but accuracy. Note-taking was always my excuse, and no one ever questioned the unobtrusive microphones hidden inside the ceiling light fixtures. I put in the earbuds and pressed play. The sound was crisp, shuffling papers, someone clearing their throat, the faint click of a pen. Then her voice, measured, rehearsed. We have an opportunity to reposition Argon Global into a high-yield speculative model. The current market favors speed over caution. If we move aggressively into leveraged instruments, cryptocurrency portfolios, and short-cycle commodities, we can double projected growth in 2 years. I closed my eyes and listened to the tone, not just the words. She believed it, or wanted the room to believe she did. But the model she was describing was a minefield, unstable, volatile, and perfectly capable of imploding the company within 18 months. I'd seen it before. The rule came back to me without effort. My silent rule, the one that had kept me alive through 3 recessions and 2 global crises. Never fight the fire head-on. Let it burn in the direction you choose. Push the fuel where you want the damage to go. That rule was born in '98, during the Peterson-Talbot attempt to take us over. Back then, I was still just the director of strategy, still hungry enough to watch every move with the patience of a chess player, waiting for a blunder. Peterson came in loud. Press releases, shareholder pitches, aggressive bids on our undervalued divisions. I didn't stop him. I fed him. Let him take on more debt, overextend his credit, and commit resources to assets I'd already written off. 6 months later, I pulled the rug out by calling in the one note he'd staked his entire operation on. The takeover collapsed in 3 days. Peterson's firm never recovered. I opened another folder on the server, my current network map. Department heads I trusted were marked in green, those loyal to the new CEO in red. The rest were gray, waiting to be swayed. I sent 2 quiet messages to key allies in operations and compliance. Both had been with me over 20 years. Both understood brevity. I turned to my contact list. Some names hadn't been spoken aloud in a decade. Regulators, trade compliance officers, market analysts, with the kind of pull that could make or break a public deal. I didn't need them to act yet, just to be ready. The beauty of moves like this was in timing. Too soon, and you tip your hand. Too late, and you're left with smoke and rubble. The market tickers shifted, a few green blips flashing on my watch list. I minimized them and brought up a secure VoIP line. The number I dialed wasn't saved anywhere. It was muscle memory from years of use. The line clicked once before a voice answered. Calm, low, no greeting. "We're live," I said. "Same plan as Shanghai." There was a pause on the other end. Then, a single word. Understood. The line went dead. I leaned back in the chair, the glow of the monitors painting the room in cool blues and greens. She thought she was steering Argonne Global toward a bold new future. I was already moving the rails beneath her feet. And when the train jumped the track, it would land exactly where I wanted it to. She moved fast. Within a week of my departure, the emails started rolling in from old colleagues, some discreet, some furious. Senior staff with decades of experience were being escorted out of the building with cardboard boxes in their arms. Men and women who had weathered market crashes, government audits, and product recalls were suddenly labeled obsolete. In their place came glossy-eyed 20-somethings in tailored sneakers and startup hoodies, most of them plucked from her own circle. College acquaintances, friends of friends from her curated networking dinners. They spoke in buzzwords, obsessed over presentation decks, and thought culture could be measured in ping-pong tables and cold brew on tap. At first, the market rewarded her. Stock tickers jumped. Headlines in the business press gushed about a bold generational pivot and modern leadership shaking up legacy models. The board soaked in the attention, blinded by the short-term glow of quarterly gains. But I'd been through too many cycles to confuse a sugar high for sustained growth. The moves were cosmetic, cheap ways to look agile without doing the slow, brutal work of reinforcing the foundation. While the spotlight stayed on her, I went underground. Through 3 different shell companies, each with its own registered address in separate states, I began buying shares. Small quantities at first, scattered across different brokers to avoid patterns, then strategically timed purchases when the price dipped on normal fluctuations. Nothing flashy, nothing anyone would notice on a quarterly report. The accumulation was slow, deliberate, a tide rising an inch at a time. Every acquisition was logged in my private ledger, cross-referenced against voting blocks I knew were soft. Some of those blocks belonged to pension funds I'd quietly advised years ago, others to private equity managers who owed me favors from deals I'd salvaged when they were on the brink of collapse. None of them knew yet that they were part of something bigger. That was the point. One night, while combing through old files, I found a photograph tucked between 2 contracts. My mentor, Robert Lang, standing in the corner office the day we closed our first overseas expansion. He was in his 60s then, still sharp, still carrying that dry humor that could cut tension in half with a single line. I could almost hear his voice from that day. "Don't ever confuse the company with yourself, Daniel. You're a steward, not a god. The minute you start thinking you own it, you've already lost it." Robert had been the one to warn me about hubris. He'd seen too many brilliant men dismantle their own legacies, chasing the high of being right. He believed in legacy, not as a monument to ego, but as a living thing that had to be protected from both enemies and the arrogance of its own leaders. That conversation had stayed with me through every deal, every market shift. Now it felt like a warning, written for this exact moment. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is messy, short-sighted, and burns through resources faster than it creates them. What I was doing was reclamation, taking back something I had spent more than half my life building before it collapsed under someone else's vanity project. She thought she was painting a masterpiece. I knew she was setting fire to the frame. The proof came sooner than I expected. A contact in financial intelligence, someone who preferred their name to stay in the shadows, called to tell me she'd been seen meeting with Victor Kroll. The name hit like a weight. Kroll was a corporate raider in the purest sense, a man who made his fortune gutting companies for parts. He didn't restructure, he stripped. He'd destroyed 2 industry giants in the last decade, leaving behind thousands of layoffs and bankrupt suppliers in his wake. If she was talking to him, she wasn't just flirting with danger. She was inviting it into the house and handing it the master key. I pulled up the hotel security feed my contact had sent. The footage showed them in the lobby of the Fairmont, shaking hands like old friends. Kroll's eyes were cold, scanning the room even as he smiled. She looked exhilarated, as if standing on the edge of something thrilling, not realizing it was a cliff. That night, I booked myself a room at the Meridian, 31 floors up, facing the city skyline. The lights of the financial district glittered against the glass, each one a small reminder of the empire I'd helped build. I stood there in the dark, the hum of the city muted through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the reflection, I could see myself, older now, lines carved by decades of deals and battles won and lost. But my eyes hadn't dulled. I watched the streets below, the taxis threading through traffic, the occasional flash of a police cruiser. Somewhere out there, she was planning her next move with a man who'd hollow her out and leave nothing but a shell for the headlines. She didn't realize that every step she took toward him was one step deeper into my design. She just handed me the keys, I whispered, and let the city keep my secret. The air in the conference center carried that sterile, over-conditioned chill meant to keep tempers down and focus up. It never worked. I walked in without an invite, my presence turning heads in quick double takes. No tie. Sleeves rolled just enough to signal I wasn't here for ceremony. My jacket was fitted but not flashy, my watch discreet. It was the uniform of someone who'd come to work, not to pose for the annual report. She was already at the head of the table, flanked by her new hires, with their thin smiles and fresher resumes. The board members were arranged in a semicircle, murmuring among themselves while glancing at the massive screen that read, "Strategic Acquisition Proposal, Project Ascend." She saw me. Her smile faltered for half a second, then returned, stretched a little too tight. The meeting hadn't started yet. That was my window. In the hallway outside, I'd already sent the final email to my contact at the financial ledger. The attachment contained every key detail of Project Ascend. The target company's shaky books, their inflated market valuations, and the fact that the acquisition price was more than double any reasonable assessment. It wouldn't hit the front page until later in the meeting, but when it did, it would detonate. Next, I triggered the second phase, a short encrypted message to a friend inside the Federal Trade and Commerce Bureau. I'd cultivated that relationship years ago over 3 late-night dinners and one well-timed favor during a compliance audit. All it took was one sentence: potential violation of fair market regulations. Recommend immediate review. By the time she hit her opening remarks, there'd be a notification on her phone from the regulators requesting an unscheduled review of the deal. When I took my seat at the far end of the table, I caught the subtle nod from two board members I'd kept in close confidence. 20-year veterans of the company, both of them, had been quietly disgusted with her tactics, but smart enough to wait for the right moment. They were the ones who would ask the first hard questions. The plan was set. Now, it was just a matter of watching it unfold. She started strong. Her voice was smooth, her pacing rehearsed, each slide of her presentation timed to the second. She spoke of innovation, market capture, and future-proofing the brand. The buzzwords flowed easily, a language meant to hypnotize shareholders into forgetting fundamentals. The first 15 minutes went her way. Then the first board member spoke up. "How do you reconcile this purchase price with the company's last 3 earnings reports?" His tone was polite, but his eyes weren't. A ripple of tension moved around the table. She smiled too quickly, answering with a string of metrics that didn't actually address the question. I saw the first bead of sweat appear at her temple. The second board member pounced. "Have you confirmed all outstanding liabilities of the acquisition target? Our legal team hasn't seen documentation." Her answer wavered, just enough to register. She shifted her stance, weight moving from one foot to the other, hand tightening on the edge of the podium. The predators in the room could smell it. Midway through her next slide, one of her assistants slid a phone onto the table beside her. She glanced down. The smile vanished. The financial ledger article had gone live. Full spread on the homepage, complete with leaked figures and a damning headline about reckless valuation practices. Murmurs erupted from the board. 2 minutes later, a junior counsel from compliance entered the room and handed her another note. The unscheduled review was official. The regulators wanted immediate disclosure of all deal terms. She read it, then looked up, her eyes darting around the table in search of a safe face. There weren't any. Her voice climbed half an octave as she tried to spin the news as a temporary misunderstanding. She leaned too far over the podium, shoulders stiff, hands gripping the wood. I caught the rapid blink pattern, 5 in quick succession, that I'd seen before in hostile negotiations. It meant she was cornered and searching for an escape route. From where I sat, I watched every tell. The clench of her jaw when a board member cut her off mid-sentence. The shallow breathing when another asked if she'd informed the full board of her talks with Victor Kroll. The way her left hand disappeared under the table to twist the cap off a water bottle she never drank from. When the questions finally slowed, I stood. The room went still. I didn't need to raise my voice. "You've all been wondering why I'm here," I said. "Why now?" I reached into my jacket and placed a simple folder on the table. Inside was the summary of my holdings, purchased quietly over the past months through proxies, trusts, and shell entities. The math was simple, but the impact wasn't. As of this morning, I continued, my voting shares, combined with those represented here by my allies, constitute controlling interest in Argon Global Industries. I let the words hang there long enough for the weight to sink in. She stared at me, color draining from her face, mouth opening and closing without sound. I stepped closer, stopping just short of the head of the table. "You're relieved of duty," I said, my voice low, even, and final. "Effective immediately." The room felt different with me at the head of the table. The same gleaming mahogany, the same panoramic view of the skyline beyond the glass, but the energy was no longer fractured. Her chair, the one she had occupied with such rehearsed confidence, was empty, rolled back slightly, as if she'd left in a hurry. The board sat in silence, a collection of men and women who had, only months ago, voted me out in the name of progress. Now they shifted in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes, a mixture of relief and embarrassment in their expressions. They knew what I knew. Removing me had not been modernization. It had been self-sabotage, dressed in the language of innovation. I didn't lecture them. There was no point in rubbing salt into wounds I needed healed quickly. Instead, I opened the meeting with the plan. Key senior staff, who had been unceremoniously pushed out, were already in the process of returning. They knew the machinery of this company, the quirks of its biggest clients, the unspoken agreements that kept supply chains flowing. Her so-called fresh blood hires had been reassigned or released. Most were already looking for the next flashy startup to inflate their resumes. The failed initiatives she'd set in motion, the speculative portfolios, the overpriced acquisition deals, the PR-heavy but profit-light side ventures, were being dismantled. We were going back to the company's spine, products and services that had built our reputation, long-term contracts with reliable margins, and the deep market relationships you can't buy with a quarterly campaign. I kept my tone measured, the language precise. This was not a victory speech. It was a field briefing. By the time we adjourned, the tension in the room had shifted. They weren't celebrating, but they weren't bracing for disaster anymore. Some even allowed themselves the smallest nods in my direction. The panic that had driven them to chase her vision had been replaced by something quieter: stability. As the board members filtered out, I stayed seated, watching the door close behind the last of them. 32 years. That was the real investment. Not the shares, not the titles, but the years of building something from a fragile idea into an operation that could withstand market crashes, competitor raids, and leadership turnover. I thought about the hundreds of livelihoods tied to the decisions made in this room. Entire families depended on whether we got it right. That weight had never left me. This was never about ego. It wasn't about proving her wrong or proving myself right. It was about protecting the thing I had poured most of my adult life into. When you build something with your own hands, when you spend decades shaping it, you don't watch it burn for the sake of politeness. You fight for it, not because you want the glory, but because you refuse to see it reduced to ashes. I glanced at the empty chair across from me and thought back to the very beginning. My first day at Argonne Global wasn't in a high-rise conference room. It was in 2 rented offices above a failing print shop. My desk was a folding table. My phone was secondhand, the cord taped where the rubber had split. The carpet was stained, the air smelled faintly of ink and dust, and the company bank account had just enough in it to cover payroll and utilities for another month, if we were lucky. I'd walked in with a briefcase that held 3 proposals, a calculator, and a vision I couldn't yet articulate without people smirking. I remembered staying late that first night, long after everyone else had gone home. I sat alone in that cramped room, looking at the city lights through a dirty window, telling myself that if I could just hold the line long enough, if I could just land one deal big enough to buy time, this place might survive. Not just survive, grow, outlive me. That was the dream, even then. Now here I was, in the top-floor boardroom, decades later, having just wrestled back control from someone who would have traded that dream for headlines. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the responsibility. I stood slowly, the scrape of the chair legs echoing in the empty room, and walked to the head of the table. My hand rested on the back of the CEO's chair, not as a throne to be claimed, but as a reminder of the burden it carried. Leadership wasn't about who sat here. It was about whether the company was stronger when they left than when they arrived. For a long moment I stood there, letting the silence settle. The city hummed faintly beyond the glass, traffic flowing in veins of red and white below. I thought about the battles ahead, the markets to stabilize, the trust to rebuild. None of it scared me. If anything, the months away had sharpened my resolve. They thought they'd buried me. All they did was give me the time to sharpen the blade. And now, the empire is quiet again, just how I like it.